Today on Sagittarian Matters, we talk comics, advice, world building, food, tools, and more with award-winning cartoonist Bishakh. Stay tuned.
Sagittarian Matters, Sagittarian Matters, what's the matter with you? Sagittarian Matters.
Bishakh is the author of 2 graphic novels, which both came out in 2020. She used to be an architect who changed her life completely and dedicated herself to comics in New York City in her 40s. Bishakh's short story collection, Apsara Engine, won the LA Times Book Prize for Graphic Literature. She also has a graphic memoir called Spellbound. Bishakh's work explores themes of gender, sexuality, memory, and urbanism, among other things. Her website states, "On a formal level, some of my pieces conflate the tools of architectural representation with those of sequential narrative in order to question these very methods and offer new means of representing space, time, and the role of the body in both simultaneously." Bishakh joined me through the magic of the internet to talk about her books, food, cartography, world building, comics tools, advice, and more. Now please enjoy my talk with award-winning cartoonist Bishakh. Before we get to listener questions, I was just listening to an interview where you said you got bagged on by the New York Times for adding so much food, but I feel like you could have even included recipes, like 15 recipes in there, because everything I was reading, especially, so there's a moment where your character has kind of these austerity cooking measures of like eating stalks and things, and it just felt very much like something I would do in any time. I just carry with me a kind of Depression era relationship to food and leftovers, and
you and me both, yeah.
And I really appreciate that. But all the food you talk about is so delicious sounding, and I was so happy to see the character taking care of herself in that way amidst the isolation of the cartoonist, which is also quite relatable.
It is funny when, that whole business of the Times not understanding, they called it a litany or something of cataloging of food, and I'm like, it's so easy to say you missed the point, but it is the point, and I'm so glad that you picked up on it, and that other people have picked up on the food, because it really was like a sub-theme to the book, and it's the way that she organizes her life and the way that she takes care of herself, as you mentioned, but also it's like this inheritance that she gets from her parents, because I think I mentioned in the book how like Bengalis and Indians in general are very food-focused, and they just can't help but use food as a sort of intermediary during conversations, or as intermediaries in familial relationships, and that's something she tries to avoid, but is unable to. So she inherits that, and I think I've inherited it to some degree as well, in the sense also that like I was going to say when the pandemic started, but this was when I started working from home before the pandemic, and became an artist, as it were, or was starting to evolve into an artist. And I thought, well, I have the wherewithal to do this for a year or year and a half, but I'll have to cut down on a lot of extravagances, which means no more like going out for lunch. And this is when that whole thing started with the the cauliflower stalks, which is something I just made. I'm getting better at it, but yeah, there is a panel where Anjali's like, oh, this cauliflower stalk curry is so useless, and I've been trying so hard to make this work, but it tastes awful. And I did feel that myself at one point while I was going through this process of like austerity plus artistic ambition. And it was a way for me to think about what I had, like, and what I could spend money on, and what I could do to feed myself and be a sort of self-sustaining person. And that's, that a lot of the cataloging comes from that idea that I had to cut down on stuff and just be a little more frugal with like, not frugal, like I had to be more aware of how I went about my day. And so that's where that cataloging comes from. But I think I have found a way to make the cauliflower stalks a little more tasty. And
What is it?
I think it's just to fry the hell out of them.
Do you bread them or anything, or you just...
No, they're part of a bigger, like I'd make a giant pot of, for lack of a better term, curry, but it's, it's just a vegetable, Indian style vegetable extravaganza. And part of that are these cauliflower stalks, which I cannot bring myself to throw away, And as you were saying, this Depression era kind of mentality that's like, that's food right there. And I'm not going to it's half of the cauliflower that you get. And I really didn't want to throw it away. And I finally found out there is an actual Bengali dish that involves focusing on the cauliflower stalk. So I'm like, oh, it's not just me. It's like my heritage. It's like propelling me into using these cauliflower stalks as part of my menu.
You were heeding an ancient call. Don't throw them away. Keep them.
In such a ways. And also the tender part of the broccoli or the stem is like, even Jacques Pepin says it's his favorite part. So who might argue?
This is good to know because I feel when I'm throwing that part away now, I'm just like,
no,
God, there's got to be more to this. Because I know it's a brassica, and with kale stalks, I'm happy to cut those really fine and include them in something and just cook them longer. So why would I eschew their cousin, the broccoli stalk?
Don't. They're gorgeous. You just peel off the outer part, and then you can steam them or saute them or whatever. Don't boil them. But they're gorgeous. They're lovely. It's my favorite part of the broccoli.
Oh my God. Someday, if I have a specifically queer food podcast or something, you have to come on and make...
I will do this.
...something or talk about something. Because I honestly, I was like, when I was hearing you say that thing about the New York Times bag, I was just like, what are they talking about? What is the New York Times talking about? Like, they loved the book Relish by Lucy Knisley. They love Crying in the H Mart. Like, all these books that involve so much food description, so much food as part of like a tapestry of talking about family and heritage and culture. And I just was like, what's the problem? The only problem for me is that I want like 50 more pages about the food. So why would they? There you could talk about food in that book endlessly. You could add like 100 more pages of just illustrated recipes and I would be there for it. But I love the books, and we have listener questions. I can give you a food question if you want.
Yeah, that would be great.
Dear Sagittarian Matters, so this person's asking me, can you please share your tahini salad dressing? I will share it with this listener. But in the meantime, as I'm saying this, if you have a go-to sauce, a go-to dressing, a go-to anything, be thinking of that really, if you have anything in your head that's like your go-to either sauce or dressing. A tahini salad dressing, this person might be talking about the one from friend of the show, Morgan. Mine, if I was going to make a tahini salad dressing, I would add some tahini, the smoothest kind you can find, a little bit of soy sauce, garlic, ginger if you're lucky, and then lemon juice or lime juice or vinegar. And you could add nutritional yeast or pepper if you want to, but just mix that up. It's just like very, very simple. I mean, if you want to add even more things to make it chunkier, like green onion or something, wonderful, but you can use that for a salad. You'd be happy about it. That
sounds delicious.
Okay. I'm a real tahini fan, really big tahini fan.
Could eat it all day. So you want to know about my go-to? Okay, it's not exactly a go-to, but it is something I've been working on and developing, which is a sort of gravy for vegetable dishes. So like you can steam a bunch of vegetables or saute them and then keep them separately. And then create this gravy, like an Indian style gravy that you then pour the vegetables into and let that simmer for a long time. But the gravy itself is interesting. It's based on a Bengali dish called posto, and I've sort of zhuzhed it up with my own sort of mashed up other ideas. So basically, it's mustard seeds. Poppy seeds, chili, ginger, garlic, and my last addition, which I tried yesterday, was tomatoes. So like just chopped tomatoes. And you blitz that whole thing. And then I chop some onions separately, fry those, and when the onions get nice and sort of tender and brown, then you pour this blitzed sauce in, and add some water or stock, and you develop that into a gravy, which then becomes a bath for for the vegetables that you've prepared and then you just let it sit for a long time, and then all the vegetables absorb the gravy, and it becomes this lovely little spa.
Oh my God, this is a delicious veggie spa.
Yeah, it is.
Do you add anything else to thicken it up, or does it just kind of do its own thing?
It's pretty thick. The paste is thick because of the ginger and the garlic. Add some onion to make it even, and then the tomato makes it more less paste-like and more sauce-like, but it's pretty thick. Like you have to dilute it actually to get it to be more of a bath, you know?
This is so exciting. Thank you for your gravy recipe. Listener, you just got way more. You just got way more than what you got, like a BOGO. You got a way better sauce than the one you've heard me talk about all the time. This is exciting. Dear Sagittarian Matters. Okay. I'm going to read you the question, then we can distill it.
Okay.
I have a couple questions about comics. It's actually 3. 1, would love to see a full list of tools used to create. 2, thoughts on effective ways to connect with illustrators if you are a writer. 3, any tips for world building in the comic medium? All right, so the tools, tools, I like to use a lot of different tools in my comics. I use a regular pencil. I use whatever I want to do when I'm thumbnailing. For pages, I use a regular pencil, blue pencils. My eyesight isn't good enough to see them later on. I used to use rapidograph, but I had to break up with them. It was an abusive relationship. It was too hard.
Same.
I started using microns again at some point, which I had gotten so upset with microns. And then I had to come back to them when I was stuck in the middle of a book and my rapidograph thing just broke up. I like a Pentel pocket brush. Or an actual brush, like a teeny weeny little brush and some ink. I don't know. I can't tell you the size or shape or anything. Sometimes I'll use a dip pen if I have to. And then I like to make gray wash just by adding some ink to little dishes of water. What do you use?
So I use a dumb old, what's this called? Papermate Sharp Writer. It's just this dumb... one of these things. But I also use, it depends on what stage I am at the penciling. So I also use traditional Staedtler Mars pencils, like 2Bs or 6Bs to do looser work. And then if to do the tighter pencils, I use just this thing. The Papermate. And then I also use microns, but only for detailed work. If there's an eye or whatever in a medium shot with an eye that I just can't do with a brush. So, and I use brushes. I use fake Sable, fake Kolinsky Sable brush number 2 or whatever. And I use Dr. Martin's what's this, high carb Black Star ink.
Me too.
Yeah, it's the best. Sarah Varon turned me onto this. And I do all that on, if I'm doing watercolor washes, then I draw right on watercolor paper. If I'm scanning and doing digital colors, then I draw on Bristol board and scan that. And for gray washes, I use 4 different or 3 different shades of gray gouache or watercolor, and dilute or do layers of gray to build up darkness. Layers of dark. And then digital colors are, I don't know if that's another conversation altogether. But yeah, those are basically my materials.
I also use a fake Kolinsky brush because I don't know if you're a vegetarian. I am. Me too. And I just like Kolinsky. It's just like a fur farm. It's just like people trimming Kolinsky's like a ferret or a mink.
Yeah. And at some point, I don't know why it took me so long to realize that. But I'm sorry for all the times that I all the years that I did use a real one. But anyway, yeah, I use a fake one now. So it's
At some point, I got a faux squirrel brush, which is, I just thought it was such a funny name of a brush. And I was like, maybe I should do a comic called Faux Squirrel, but I don't know.
you should do. Okay. Yeah.
I don't even know what it would be. Do you have any tips for world building in the comic medium?
That's hard.
I mean, I honestly, I feel more, I mean, I personally, I do these Linda Berry writing exercises for lots of things, including times, people, punk houses, or events, where I will think of the place, wherever the place of it, and I'll do this kind of thing where I kind of drop in and I remember everything in a memory that's like in front of me and below me and to my sides, and I try to absorb every single detail of that or of my experience with the persons, and then I do it that way. But like, I see a lot of people get stuck in world building of like research and like language and backstories, and it's a nice procrastination method to never actually do a comic.
Yeah, exactly. That's so tough. I don't know quite what to say. I'm teaching a class at SVA on storytelling this semester, and I think this question has come up, like, when do you stop world building? Or how far can you go in order for then to be able to tell a story and not just have this like background, or I don't want to use the word background, but like this world that has nothing going in. There's no story inhabiting that world, right? I'm really not I don't know if I can offer tips because I'm still trying to figure it out, The best I can say is keep a sketchbook or a notebook and just and I don't know, keep a catalog of like details. I mean, I'm thinking architectural details and or environmental details or interior details, and then I don't know how like crazy you have to go with like creating like a D&D manual with this entire world, and for you to then start writing a story. I would just focus on the story and then and sort of think of how the environments can serve the story. But I don't know, that just sounds dumb to me now. I don't know. It's a great question, but I don't know quite how to answer it.
I would say, I think to build off of what you're saying about a sketchbook, I'd find a lot of students, if they're a little insecure about their drawing, they'll try to spend forever making documents about their world. And so I would encourage them to take that sketchbook that you're having them keep with them and like do as much drawing as you can of the world. Because at a certain point, that will just compel you to, you're going to have to draw the thing a million times. So you got to get really comfortable drawing the thing. You can't spend 2 hours on one drawing that then you can't make move. That's a hard part.
I mean, okay. Like right now I'm working. Oh, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I was going to say this, this new project that I'm working on, which is, to just give us a very like brief description of it. It's ostensibly a travel guide, and but it's a travel guide to an imaginary city, and then it sort of fails at being a travel guide. So that's the conceit of the book. But I've been watching a lot of travel shows, and like if there's an image that strikes me on TV or like as part of a program, I'll try to somehow capture that image as inspiration. I've been keeping a catalog of these images that are inspiration, and maybe that inspirational image will then sort of launch a chapter in the book. But it's just inspiration. It's not like it's not like a strategy to create an entire scenario. It's just a way to say, maybe there's a temple with these grounds that the characters are going to sort of wander through, but you don't have to like catalog every single detail of this place, It's not like you have to create a model of it or this is not like a Tolkien-esque kind of endeavor. So I would say be loose about it as well. Don't let the world building dominate the process.
I think that's really smart. I had a question that I forgot to ask you, but you published, may I ask, how old are you?
Oh, God, I'm 53.
This is inspiring to me because people write, I'm 40.
Okay.
People write all the time to the podcast and want to know, like, oh, I'm 36.
Yeah.
I'm too old to pick up a new craft, or to like people have this idea of you having to have been in your art since you were like a Beyonce style kind of like, your parents were putting you on stage as a young person and then you got there. But I find a lot of my favorite artists, their books came out when they were after their 30s. And I just want to tell listeners like, oh my gosh, she just put out 2 books just now. Like you worked on them for a very long time and you're a professional artist in the architectural arts for a long time, but I just feel like it's never too late to just do the thing you want to do.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's what Spellbound is all about, is like dropping one thing to do another. But it's not like you can't do that at the time I was in my 40s, right, when I quit architecture. So yeah, I was like, no, I'm going to do this no matter what, because that's the one thing I've got going. Like, this is the one thing I'm good at, and it wasn't architecture. But also I think, I've been drawing since I was a kid. So this is something that's always been part of my life. It's just that I got waylaid in the middle with thinking I had to do something professional. And it was only circumstances like, my family, mainly my family, not being there to for me to feel guilty about that, led me, and my boss, sort of imploding, for all of those things to come together in order for me to be able to have the courage to make a switch, and that did happen in my 40s, but it can happen at any time for anybody, Luckily I had this like plan B all along. It's just that it took a bunch of life swerves in life in order for me to be able to realize that plan.
I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your kind of transparency in your work of being like, okay, from life circumstances, I had this time. I was able to have time to sit and work on this thing I had always wanted to work on. And I think, even for me, I always wanted to be a freelancer. I know that sounds like I always wanted to freelance, but it took me getting like a swath of money from a job to have the courage to leave one of my day jobs to say, okay, I have 6 months to figure out a way to make this financially sustainable. This money's buying me 6 months. But it wasn't like a publisher came to my door with a publisher's clearinghouse check and said, this money's going to change your life, kid.
Right.
Like, that's not what happened. I had to find that for myself by taking some kind of lucrative job or having some kind of, thing happen where there was enough money to buy a little.
That's exactly what it was. In my case, it was coming into some money from deaths in my family. So it was like, I'm very thankful for that. I mean, even if it involved losing, I basically have no more family in the States. But the upside of that, if you can say that, is that it bought me some time, and it bought me the privilege and opportunity to do what I've always wanted to do my whole life. And yeah, it was a very fortuitous coming together of life events, which sounds corny, but yeah, it happened,
Well, I don't wish the death upon you, but I'm very happy that you were able to make this beautiful work with those resources and that time.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rachel Jolie, Colleen Garland, Emily Helmus, Shoshana Ruth Wechter, and Joey Soloway. If you would like to support Sagittarian Matters, in particular producer Chris Sutton, please send $5, $5 million, that's your business, to hornetleg@gmail.com on PayPal. Via PayPal, it's hornet like the insect, leg like its appendage @gmail. Or, this just in, he's got a Venmo, Hell Books on Venmo. That's HE books. Thank you for your support, and we look forward to saying your name on the podcast. Producer Ponyo looks forward to it too. Don't be scared.
That's just Panyo's speaking voice. Okay, so Apsara Engine came out. You were working on that book first, but how many years did it take you from writing your first story that was going to be in that book to finishing drawing it? Forget even like the publication schedule.
It's a little hard to say because the stories in that book started off as short stories that I just wrote. Some of them had been self-published as mini comics. Some had I wrote with no intention of, or no idea how they would end up, where they would end up. But they're all, the earliest story is quite old. I think I remember starting it in something like 2003. But, it wasn't a sustained effort at all. Like these stories came and went sporadically between like 2003 and by the time Feminist Press picked it up. But I was doing all this other stuff in between. So it was just intermittent attempts at writing stories. And then at some point I thought I had enough material to collect into a book. And that's when I started thinking of these stories as a sort of book-shaped entity, But even after that, even after Feminist Press agreed to take it on, I went back and redrew, I would say like 70% of the book because of the time it had taken for these stories to come together, and my drawings from 2003 were certainly not as good as what I was able to do in 15 or 16 or 17. So I was like, I can't publish, I can't have these really kind of almost like juvenilia out there. So I went back and redrew all of it so it looked more of a piece. And then I wrote another story, which is Swan Dive, which is the only story that really represents me as an author after coming out as trans, The rest were written before that. So, and I think if you read the book, you can sort of sense that there's a sort of not a gap, but there's a movement towards a certain sensibility, a certain more queer and trans sensibility with that story specifically.
It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, all of your work is so beautiful, but it also really makes me want to see the 2003 version too, like the cutting room floor. No, no.
Oh, no one will ever see that.
Really?
It's so bad. I mean, no, it's not. But the anatomy's off. All the gestures, the body language, it's just off. And I learned so much in the interim. I know everyone says that about their early work, but it's really just painful to look at. It's tucked away in a box somewhere.
Oh my gosh. Well, maybe someday if you ever had a retrospective, there could be a room where someone had to have a key or a password or something. And you'd be you can go in there for 30 seconds.
Right.
You can glance at this and then you're escorted out by a security.
Right. You have to sign an NDA and you're ushered out by armed security or something.
Maybe you even get a poof of some kind of ether or some kind of something to clear your memory afterwards.
Yeah.
But you just get that moment of being
oh, these are terrible. Yeah.
The evolution of the art.
I know.
Well,
right.
I felt like when I was writing Calling Dr. Laura, I didn't get my sea legs until 6 months or something into inking the book or drawing. So page 1 to the epilogue is so different. Yeah. And when I first looked, it made me want to barf when I first looked at it, just even a year later after making the proposal story. But now I feel like I kind of am okay, this is just an archive of what was happening then. But unlike you, I did not have the energy to go back and redraw it, or else I would have, but also maybe I would have never stopped drawing, because as I would draw things and get better, I would. You could just be in an eternal loop and be I'm just going to redo this. I know something today that I didn't know 2 months ago. I want everything to look like this tool.
Exactly. Yeah. No, luckily I didn't get stuck in that cycle, but I'm happy with the amount I was able to repair, for lack of a better way of putting it,
Well, your work does look really consistent. It looks really lovely. The body, like your figure drawing is so lovely. The bodies are so lovely. The way people are drawn and the movement. It just, I mean, I can see the attention to detail and the consistency through all the drawings. And then, of course, I can't help but wonder how your architecture training or career informs all the landscapes and world building that exist in your books.
So, I mean, on a very like fundamental or basic level, just having had the education to be propelled into like imagining spaces and having to represent those spaces on paper by drawing, which is not the case anymore in a lot of architecture schools because so much of it is computer aided, right? But having to draw with pen and paper and pencil overlaps obviously really nicely with comics because it's the same tools. But also just having had to participate in strategies of representing space allowed me to be more conversant with drawing the environments that my characters inhabit, whether or not they're banal, and so like I can imagine more clearly, like just the interior of one of the characters' apartments or the kitchen or the living room. But the other thing that architecture school did for me was, at a certain point, you kind of you're encouraged to imagine spaces and buildings and forms, and it's a time in one's life when it's okay to be a little wild and to propose structures that are not necessarily feasible or structurally sound, but to work on them as proposals of the imagination. And at some point that drops out because you end up with a job at a place where you have to, design bathrooms with toilets that function and sinks and, all the like nitty gritty. And then all the sort of imagination is drained right out of it. And I think that's a lot of what ejected me out of the practice of architecture. But luckily I was able to channel all that back into comics. And so that's, all that sort of stirring of the imaginative thought that happened in grad school was then I could take that energy. That's the part I liked about architecture school. Take that and transfer it to my comics and art practice. So that's, it was a fortunate kind of progression for me. I could have just let it go completely, but I found a way to find a hybrid space between architecture and comics and art. And that's something I'm really interested in developing as a practice.
It looks so incredible. And I don't even know. So one of your characters was speaking at length about, was it queer cartography or trans cartography and just like map making and our paths. Can you talk about that?
Well, originally there's a speech at the beginning of the story Swan Dive where one of the characters, it turns out, is giving a presentation at an academic panel, and she's talking about trans geographies and trans cartography. And initially I wrote that whole spiel as a sort of, honestly, I didn't know what I was talking about, but the more I wrote it, as if it was her voice. I mean, it is her voice, but I wrote it initially to make her seem a little highfalutin and pretentious. But the more I wrote it, the more I was like, wait a minute, maybe there's something here. And I think, it translates obviously into the second half or latter half of that story where the issue of map making comes into play. And I think it does tie back to her spiel about trans geographies and cartographies, but it becomes something much more intuitive and sensual and not as cerebral. And that was the core of the story to begin with, right? It was this idea that you can use drawing and map making or architecture, these tools to create imaginary worlds, specifically queer and trans sort of utopias, right? You can will them into being through the act of drawing, which is what they end up doing. They put it into practice, right? And that whole spiel at the beginning about trans geographies was meant to be a sort of foregrounding of that, but also a kind of more intellectualization of that process. And the more the story came into being, the more those two things sort of collapsed into each other. But yeah, it's like, you know, the inspiration for that story was the way queer and trans folks like create worlds that don't exist for themselves because they have to. It's almost like a survival mechanism. It's a way of creating culture and a way of defining ourselves, you know? And that act of imagination was something I wanted to distill and represent through what I do, which is, you know, as a practice, which is drawing. And I think there are parallel practices, and I wanted to sort of represent that, how those two things are parallel or concurrent, you know.
When you were saying defining, you kind of almost said divining, and I was like, you're doing both! You're doing both! It reminded me so much, too, of like Edie Fake's work of creating these spaces on the page.
Yeah.
These fantasy spaces, even out of architecture that used to exist and what it could be. And it also reminds me, a lot of times on the podcast, we talk about like queer failure or how queer people aren't following this measure of, you know, here's a life, here's the steps to life. And by this age, you're at this point, and that we get to make our own paths and not judge ourselves against that kind of heteronormative framework of,
yes,
here's a life. And so I don't even know if I have anything like incredible to say about that, but I just really love that tie-in of all of those ideas together.
Thank you. And I guess I should say I'm like that. It's a theme that I find myself immersed in a lot, and I'm trying to develop those themes of utopia, of imagination, of not necessarily of drawing, but of queer utopias, and I'm trying to expand that. So I'm working on a third book now that is hopefully going to take the sort of ideas that were kernels or germs in Swan Dive and expand it into an entire book.
How has your practice changed since, okay, so you drew, and we have to circle back to Spellbound in a second, but how has your process changed since when you first started imagining the short stories from Apsara Engine to then working on Spellbound kind of while you were waiting and, you know, doing this to now?
Honestly, that's something I'm going to have to confront as I'm working on this third book. Like the projects I worked on after the two books were published were small, sort of finite contributions to. I did a short story for the Georgia Review. I did a story for eFlux Journal, and I just finished a story for the Boston Review. But all of those are short stories that are bite-sized, and I kind of know how to handle that because I've done those. You know, that's how I started Apsara Engine, right? So I'm not sure how my process has changed. I won't know until I confront until I figure out a way to make this third book into something more than just notes in my sketchbook, which is what it is right now. So it's my first attempt at a sustained, continuous narrative, other than Spellbound, which is a memoir, so it's a different project altogether. But yeah, I'm anxious but also excited to see how I tackle something of this scale, a narrative project of this scale, because I kind of don't know how to do it. So that's, you know, I would like to know the answer to your question as well. So I'm going to have to find out. It's a little daunting. Even right now, I'm trying to figure out how to draw the thing, like whether I should use my usual Apsara Engine watercolors or not. And I'm starting to think maybe not. Maybe I should do it digitally, or I don't know. I'm still trying to work it out. So I'm looking at a lot of other artists to see like what the possibilities are, and and to see how I should tailor my process to this new, future strategy.
It's really hard to
Yeah.
figure out.
Uh-huh.
I'm proposing a couple books right now, and I really want to draw them different than my style that I've drawn other books in, because it seems fun,
Yeah.
and because I've kind of beat the fun out of from my memory of drawing those books, which is like labor or something.
Yes.
I feel like I beat the fun out of like inking with ink and using gray wash and having to get rid of the pencils, and then the
that's the worst part.
laborious Photoshop. Yeah. Then like the Photoshop kind of levels of like, ooh, I want the black to be black, but
Yes.
I want to maintain the gray wash. But
You and me
I
both.
just,
That's exactly what I go through. Yeah.
but then I'm like, I'm just going to draw a whole book in pencil. And but I have a compulsive element in me that just after I've drawn it in pencil, it's like, not enough.
Yeah,
Keep
exactly.
going.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah, I sometimes don't know when to stop either, but I'm trying to find a happy medium where I can not stifle myself with this new project, and I can have some sense of progress and not kind of get in front of myself and, create roadblocks because of my own psyche.
I mean, that's the thing, is that the call's always coming from inside the house. It's like, I'm like, everybody's going to know. Nobody wants me to draw this in pencil. And I'm just like, nobody cares. I'm like, I'm going to draw my characters with different eyes. That's crazy. And I'm just like, nobody cares.
I know.
There's a council in my mind.
Exactly. Yesterday I was drawing like character sketches for this third book, and I'm like, and I was thinking about eyes too, and I'm like, should I just use like dots or should I do like full on eyes, or, and I was like, is this a big decision? I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. So I was like, no, I think I'm going to go to sleep because I can't make this decision now,
It's too late. I have a rule sometimes that after 10 p.m. I have the will, but not the way. Where after 10 p.m. I'll be like, just ink it. You can ink it. But if I will start making mistakes or start making broad proclamations that then later in the light of day, I'm like, what have I done?
Oh yeah, no, I never ink after a certain point. Like I think my cutoff is like 7. Yeah, inking, forget it. That has to be in the light of day.
Well, for what it's worth, I really like the way you draw eyeballs.
Thank you. No one's ever said that to me.
Oh my God, I was noticing it because all your characters have a similar look to them no matter who they are. Like you have a very distinct style of drawing characters.
Yeah.
And as I was reading your books again, I was like, I think a really strong part of it is the eyes and the eye placement and just where the eyes are is really, it's really one of my favorite things.
Thank you. That's why I was concerned about just drawing them as dots as I did in Spellbound. Like it was shorthand, but I also like that, I think it's like, I just looking at other people's work, I'm like, this works, and it retains a kind of, I don't know. Well, there's a cute quality to it, which I like, but also, you can do so much with expression, even if they're just dots. But I do miss, like, as I do miss drawing full on eyes and sort of, kohl lined eyeliner, and eyebrows and really going into the fine details of a face. So I'm still trying to figure that one out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would support your work even if they were dots as eyes.
Just all
Just
dots.
giving just all dots.
It's a new pointillist project. Right?
Well, I would read that too. I would look forward to that entire project. Well, so when you finished Apsara Engine on your own, is that when you picked up Spellbound? Because you had that kind of vacuum of time and space? How did that project begin?
Yeah, it was after I sent out the first manuscript for Apsara Engine to like the big 3, which they've probably changed by now, but like Fantagraphics and Drawn Quarterly and Top Shelf, and I was waiting for replies from them, and I was like, I'm not sure what to do now. So I started just like keeping a diary comic, which I had never done in my life. But, as I say in the book, I couldn't bring myself to draw myself into my diary comic. So I created this other character. And honestly, it was just more like therapy for me rather than anything with a long-term plan. And I don't remember at what point it became something more sustained. Like I think I was going to do a reading at the poetry project, and I wasn't sure what to read, so I there's a chapter in Spellbound where Anjali goes back to India to move her parents there, and it's like a 23-page chapter, and that was the longest I'd considered doing an episode of Spellbound. But once I'd finished that, in order to have something for this reading, I was like, oh, wait a minute, I can actually make this more than just a collection of diary comics. It can be something more, I don't know, continuous or less episodic. And that's when I started to just kind of keep adding. I just kept adding to it. And I think at some point there was enough work, enough material that it was proposable, if that's a word. And that's when I showed it to Liz at Street Noise Books. And when it started to, the possibility of it becoming a book was, for the first time, really something that came up for me. And that's when I went back to it and started like filling in the gaps of the book. Because it was like, I did it, like I say, episodically. So there were parts of my life, parts of the process of drawing Apsara Engine, which is never mentioned in the book, but that's the book that I was working on. Parts of that process that I missed out in writing the diary comic. So I went back, wrote, filled in those gaps and wrote some longer chapters about like my childhood and stuff. And eventually it sort of like fattened up and became, something that went beyond the initial idea of a diary comic and turned into something else completely. And I guess like approached memoir. And that's something I never would have really imagined when I started it as a therapeutic exercise.
I wonder if having I don't know what you would call Anjali as like a protagonist kind of puppet, or I don't know what you would call her as, a stand-in.
I've been calling her like either an ambassador or substitute, which I'm not liking that word anymore. So I don't know. I've been using the word ambassador for some reason, just because I think it's a nice word.
Did having an ambassador make you feel, were there things that you could express through her, or things that character could do on the page that are different than what you would have done had you just been drawing yourself?
Yes. There are moments of fantasy in the book, which I'm not afraid to say, because it is a memoir, but there are moments where Anjali does stuff that I guess would have thought of doing or have there's levels of desire that she expresses that I would not feel comfortable expressing as myself. So in that sense, she's, diving into my ego or into my id maybe, and bringing and acting out all the stuff that I wouldn't act on myself. So, I know there are some like sort of erotic encounters in the book, which are more fantasy or are more dreamlike, that, are neither memoir or total fiction. It's just sort of like, brainwaves, whether they're mine or Anjali's. But there are moments where she's like ranting at people on the subway, which is, stuff I would have bottled up inside of me that she gets to express, but I don't. Or that there's a scene where she's confronted by this hipster at a party, and he's just like kind of calling her out on her privilege, and she kind of wails on him, and gets to justify or validate herself or justify her project of starting a graphic novel and like, going into a new career path, given the opportunities that life or the circumstances that life has thrown at her. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot too. Like, how do I justify myself doing this project when I know a lot of other people can't? So that whole episode was a sort of way of me thinking out and drawing out all the stuff that was making me feel guilty about my project, which sounds slightly ridiculous now, but it's something I felt at the time I wanted to put on the page.
I really appreciated that part so much. I mean, that's like, hold on, my producer's growling.
Ponyo.
Because she also appreciated that part.
Oh.
She's the sentry of the house.
Editor and sentry.
I appreciated that part. I appreciated there is a panel where she has almost a hothead paisan fantasy of stabbing these kind of bro dudes.
Yeah. That actually happened. I mean, minus the murder, it actually happened on the train up to my wife's mom's place. And it was horrific. I mean, those guys were having that conversation. And I was like, what I wouldn't do for like hothead paisan energy right now and just, kind of rips them to shreds. But, there's only so I went to another seat and I turned up my iPod to like 11 with like some punk rock, and I just made them go away in my head. But it really stuck with me. It was a horrific moment, It was
For listeners who haven't read it, it was basically these guys just like bragging about having sex with people and being gross. Yeah,
and it was just very like misogynistic and homophobic and these jerks just like taking up so much space with their voices. It was gross.
I think that I wouldn't have fared well in that situation. I think I would have screamed at them or kicked their seat and gotten in big trouble.
Yeah. That happens to me in movie theaters, but that's why nobody wants to go with me to the movies anymore.
Oh my! I mean, I've had different times where I've had these confrontations with men in public where it's just been just like me being like, can you just like get away? Can you back up? And then some guy being like, you're being a fucking cunt. And I just screamed. I was like, did you just say I was a fucking cunt? Like just screaming the thing that they said out loud and just. Right. But then like the whole rest, this happened on my way into a Miyazaki movie. And the whole time I was there seeing Princess Mononoke. The
contrast could not be greater.
No, I was like at the Science Museum seeing a revival of Princess Mononoke by myself. And I had my water bottle still full of water in case I needed to use it as a weapon. I was like shaking the whole movie being like, how am I going to get to my car? I got to beat this guy in the head with my water bottle.
Oh my gosh. Is this when Ponyo comes in and like tears the miscreant's head off, right? Which is what Ampersand does in the fantasy panel in the train. Well,
so Ampersand is the cat that appears in Spellbound. Is that cat a composite character?
It is. He is a composite character, like of all the cats I've ever loved. One of whom is sleeping on the bed right now. But he's kind of a composite, an amalgam of all these cats.
I knew that Anjali was a stand-in ambassador, but then I was shocked to find that there was multiple cats. I was like, none of them are named Ampersand? Oh my God. I was scandalized that multiple cats. But it's such a perfect character. And there is like that hothead paisan moment of your cat coming with you to just bite these guys. And I really appreciated it.
Sagittarian Matters is produced by Chris Sutton, with assistance by Ponyo Georges. Our theme music is composed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs of the band Bouquet. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.